Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Sara Gon. Sara, how are you doing?
I'm well, thank you, Nick.
And I'm also joined by Mr. Marius Roodt. Marius, how are you?
How's it, Nick? How's it going?
Sorry, just had to sneeze there. Anyway, let us start off with an important milestone that, according to some calculations, we will cross tonight, which is that we will now have had more load shedding this year than in the entirety of last year in terms of the number of hours. In terms of days, I think we're still somewhere around 100 days of load shedding less than last year, but obviously there's been a lot fewer days in the year so far. We're not even halfway through. But we look set to cross that unfortunate milestone. So, yeah, load shedding this year has not been great. But speaking of load shedding this year, there's a great story in the Daily Maverick, which we just have to talk about because it is so outrageous and wacky and just infuriating. It's glorious, almost. And this is that there is going to be a summit hosted by the Department of Labor to discuss various labor policy and international relations issues with members of the BRICS group of countries. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Most of the people attending, around 200, are mid-level government employees from South Africa. There are a few foreign dignitaries as well who are going to be in Port Alfred from the 7th of May to the 13th of May. But what makes this a little bit special is that according to the reporting in the Daily Maverick, the Department of Labor requested that the town for the duration of the conference be exempted from load shedding in its entirety. So this request was apparently initiated by Sipho Ndebele, who is the acting Deputy General, Director General for Labor Policy and International Relations at the Department of Labor. They then sent this all the way up to Megawatt Park, Eskom's headquarters in Johannesburg, where apparently approval was granted. But however, due to how slow the entire process was, they only suspended load shedding on Monday rather than on Sunday. The Daily Maverick did reach out to an Eskom executive and ask them for their take on this, to which they replied, "I don't think this is true. This sounds like a hoax. We wouldn't grant exemptions to anyone." Well, I suspect they're not telling the truth here. Sara, what do you make of this story? Exempting an entire town because there's a government conference going on. It's not the first time, by the way, we've seen this. Nasrec, the ANC's elective conference, also was exempted from load shedding for mysterious reasons in December of last year.
No, I think it's true because it is so annoying and outrageous. So it suggests that, the levels of outrageousness and the truth go hand in hand. It wouldn't surprise me at all. It obviously wouldn't surprise me if they're trying to curry favor with BRICS and not show how bad the management of the country is. It is completely outrageous, particularly as I'm not sure that the Department
just
of
on
Labor,
that point, sorry. A lot of the embassies in Pretoria are actually exempted from load shedding, presumably for the same reason.
Well, it's just, I suppose it brings out, as I said, brings out the inner socialist in me, because why should the embassies and the MPs whose residences are also exempted from load shedding in case they have to get up in the middle of the night, says Gwedi Mantashe, good grief. It actually says something about their regard for us mere mortals who pay our taxes and vote or don't vote in the elections. It's an appalling thing. There is no reason why they wouldn't treat us differently. They wouldn't, if we were having a week-long conference in Kakamas or whatever, we can forget it. I mean, there's no way Eskom would even consider it. So it's just an exercise in sort of, beating your chest and showing how powerful you are. And of course, when a government ministry gets together for a webinar, for a conference that lasts for a week, you've got to wonder what the hell they're talking about that they can fill a whole week.
Marius, what do you make of the story? I mean, it's very much, it's almost like straight out of the book Animal Farm, right? All South Africans are equal, but some are more equal than others. It's just, and I guess the bigger point here, the bigger problem is this: we have an electricity grid that's really on the edge. And we know that if it's pushed a little bit too far, it could fall over, and that would be very catastrophic, as you've talked about a lot of times on the show. This really seems to me as yet more evidence that the grid is being interfered with for political reasons. What do you make of this story?
Yeah, I mean, just before you mentioned Animal Farm, I was actually just thinking that, I mean, like I said, this is also a bit of a dog bites man story, I think. Like, this doesn't surprise anybody in, the government does seem to think that it's, it's officials and, not just the government, the ANC thinks it's, better than ordinary people, that they can ask for exemptions and so on. And it's actually, I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, the best way that you could get away with not doing these kinds of things would be to actually have a stable electricity grid. And the only way we're going to get that is obviously to ending corruption, fixing the grid, privatizing a lot of it and all that kind of thing, which the ANC obviously is not going to even countenance, or it might. I mean, I think the reality and ideology are having a kind of a battle in South Africa at the moment. And I still think it's 50-50 about which one's going to win. But if ideology wins instead of reality, then we're definitely going to see, grid collapse, South Africa continuing to go the way it's going. But reality might also win. Reality's won in South Africa before, it's won in other countries. So, I mean, I don't think everything's lost at the moment. But I think this was certainly a time when ideology won. And it also shows the absolute contempt that the government holds ordinary South Africans in.
Yeah, so I'm beginning to suspect that if there is such a thing as if a grid collapse does happen, it's going to be far less from bad luck and far more due to direct political meddling. So as far as I understand, Eskom keeps this sort of reserve margin at all times, where it generates a little bit more electricity than it actually needs, so that if something breaks all of a sudden, it doesn't throw the whole grid into meltdown. But that's very tempting for political forces to say, well, we need to exempt this particular thing from load shedding at the moment. And so you can just see that reserve maybe getting shrunk a little bit. And I believe that's the site of that reserve being shrunk. I think it was back in February, which caused JP Luntman, who has previously been very optimistic about the country, to start talking about grid collapse in major papers. Sara, any final thoughts on the story?
No, I don't think ideology comes into it at all. I think it's pure contempt and aggrandizement on their part for something that I very much doubt that we'll actually see the benefits of any policy that comes out of this. It's enraging, just as enraging as we've said, because of how little they care about us, how little bit they think about us. And I do think that the political interference has been and will continue to be substantial. They've already said that they're struggling to deal with the corruption and the sabotage. Well, are they struggling, or are they just not doing anything about it? So,
yeah, but Becky Clele has assured us all that there is huge political will to deal with the sabotage.
Yeah, huge. Where is the people?
Yes, I would encourage all opposition parties in the country to take note of this story and perhaps make it more widely known, because this really is the kind of thing that I think a lot of South Africans won't ever hear about. But if they did, even fairly loyal ANC voters would think to themselves, maybe we need to rethink our position. Anyway, let's move on to our next story. And this is that Home Affairs is going to have to revert to its old system for the population registry after the fancy new one that it sought to purchase back in 2017 has failed to materialize. The Department of Home Affairs wanted to avoid upgrading its system by relying on the already existing government biometrics department. So it went overseas to get this biometrics identification system, which would include sort of, I think, eye scans and fingerprints and stuff, to your photo, as well as photo identification, to the Home Affairs system for keeping track of the population. It signed a 64 million rand contract with this foreign company, and it was supposed to go live in May of 2019 and be fully implemented in March of 2021. Well, it's May of 2023, and no such project has materialized in the slightest. The Auditor General found that the tender was irregular. It found that the company selected was unfairly favored, and the company responsible has submitted some writing now that says that basically it's not going to be able to meet any of the deadlines. And so the Department of Home Affairs has had to cancel the project after having paid 14 million of the 65 million rand out, and basically go back to the old system of essentially using paper because this new one is not materializing. Marius, what do you make of the story?
It's another dog bites man story, I'm afraid. I mean, people are going to you'd be more shocked if you read a story that, a new system was implemented at Home Affairs and the tender was clean and it was done within 2 years and everything's running smoothly, and you go to Home Affairs now and you stand in the queue for half an hour, whatever it is, you get helped quickly, you get your passport or your ID within 2 days. That would be more shocking in South Africa. And, it's just, I mean, nobody's surprised by this kind of story. Everybody's like, shrugs their shoulders and moves on. If this happened in any, country that actually works abroad, people would be losing jobs, people would be falling on their swords, it would be all kinds of things. Yeah, probably the person who, appointed or ran the tender process has probably been promoted. They're probably the ambassador to Sweden or something at the moment. Nobody's lost their jobs. And I mean, excuse my French, but nobody seems to give a shit. Like, things can fall apart. Nobody wants to, there's no consequences for anything going on. And when these kinds of things happen, I mean, the government, for better or worse, it's an organization that affects the lives of all South Africans. So now if Home Affairs isn't working, then you can't go, it takes you a year to register your child's birth. It takes you a year to get an ID book. It takes you a year to get your marriage certificate, whatever the case is. And people need those kinds of things if they think of immigrating or if they want to buy a house and, get their kid registered in a school, all kinds of things. It has all kinds of knock-on effects. But there's no consequences for these kinds of things when they happen. And I mean, like I said, it's a dog bite man story. Nobody's surprised. And I mean, South Africa's a country of, yeah, I mean, that's a good point that Joking Atheist makes there. But yeah, I mean, and that's also why we have the problems in South Africa. There's no consequences. I mean, I've spoken about it on the show before. I mean, Collins Khoza was murdered during the lockdown. He was beaten to death by soldiers. Not one person. Nobody even knows who did it. Nobody lost their jobs. More South Africans, I'm sure, know who killed George Floyd. I know for a fact, more South Africans know who killed George Floyd and who killed Collins Khoza. Nobody lost their jobs for Collins Khoza dying. And a man died, and there are no consequences for it. Obviously, a man dying is worse than Home Affairs not working, but it's it's on the kind of the same scale of no consequences for not doing your job or for any wrongdoing. And that is, I mean, probably when you get down to it, that's 80% of the reason why South Africa is in this kind of the drang that we are.
So the quote in the story that attributed to Aaron Motsoaledi, the Minister for Home Affairs, I thought was probably not the best choice of words. He said he was disappointed that this international company was having these failures. The situation we are faced with, he said, is completely unacceptable, extremely frustrating, and we are despondent about this matter. Sara, your thoughts?
Not half as despondent as we are. I think what we have to accept is one of the problems with an ANC public service administration is that dismissal for incompetence, for rigging a tender, for whatever it is, doesn't often result in dismissal. It results in deployment. So what problems you've got at Home Affairs, if you shift them to health, you're still going to have incompetent or unwilling or lazy people. So whatever it is, and with due respect to Aaron Motsoaledi, he was not a great health minister. And when one saw he was going to Home Affairs, you thought, these people do not have any idea. They have never worked in nor run a business as in a private business where you will be subjected to all the pressures, and only you can resolve with how those pressures get dealt with. But I think here it's kind of, you don't have those skills, you don't have that experience, so every failure just becomes another another mishap, unfortunate as it may be. And look, given the amounts of money, I've kind of wondered, and I assume it has something to do with the irregularities rather than anything else, but there may be incompetence involved here. In this day and age, who pays anything towards a contract until it's finished and working?
Yes.
Obviously, you do if you're incompetent, or you do if providing a kickback to somebody. And I mean, I suspect with an entity like Home Affairs, if a coalition government takes over, it would actually have to run a parallel department while it streamlines, sorts out, and chucks out, and whatever it needs to do to an old one. To try and go in and undo it, it was probably beyond. It's probably beyond help.
Now, I think that is a major problem that a lot of the new government would probably actually have to embark on, is things like creating these sort of parallel structures as temporary stopgaps until the older systems are fixed. Marius, any final thoughts on this one? This is yet another story in a very long list, and I actually wrote an article about this, I think, last year, of how South Africa's government really seems to struggle, particularly with IT systems. I always, of course, remember those comforting words from the Gauteng provincial website, where one of the images proudly said, placeholder text, insert image here. Which kind of sums up the quality of South Africa. Why is it that we just can't ever seem to get IT systems in particular right?
I think just because things aren't getting done properly, And also, instead of going for the people who are going to do the best job at the best price, you have to look for all kinds of things: who's connected, who's got the best BE score. And the government doesn't look for the best value for money. It's which crony can get the best deal. But I think it's also, if, say, by some miracle we get the Swiss bureaucrat party decides to come run in the elections next year, and they're all run by Swiss bureaucrats who've been, all worked in Bern for 20 years or whatever you, but now they can run the South African election. And even if the Swiss bureaucrat party wins 60% of the vote next year and they take over, it would still be such a monumental effort to change what's happening in the country and the trajectory. Any big organization or any complicated kind of entity like South Africa is, it's not something. It's like, think of it as turning around a big boat. You don't just pull up the handbrake and turn the steering wheel, whatever it is that boats have. It's something that takes, you got to do a big turn and before you can change direction. I think that's the same kind of thing with South Africa. Even if tomorrow we replaced every single useless bureaucrat in the government with somebody who's very experienced and works hard, and you get rid of all the corruption and everything, all the terrible things in South Africa tomorrow, it would still take, it's a decade-long project at least to turn around the trajectory of South Africa, unfortunately. And I think, it's going to be a hard job, I think, doing that. But look, it's obviously not impossible. Countries have turned things around, but
Right.
It takes a lot to do that. So, you need political will, you need hard work, and you need money as well. No,
and of course, the sooner we start, the better. Because, as you say, it is going to take a long time, and that's in the best case scenario that we, 10 years is the more optimistic one. Let's move on to our next story, and this is one that I think is sort of on the surface looks kind of almost uncontroversial, but then when you look into the details, it gets a little bit more exciting. And this was a declaration by City Power, that is the city entity that is responsible for maintaining the distribution grid in Johannesburg. That if you are not a paying customer, City Power will no longer fix your electricity. Seems reasonable enough. Seems like something I can totally get behind, except then when you begin to look into the details, they say, before dispatching teams to a power outage, City Power will ensure that at least 70% of the customers in an area with a medium voltage outage are paying customers. If not, our technicians will not go ahead with investigation, repairs, or restore power in those areas. So now I'm thinking of a common problem in parts of particularly poorer suburbs in South Africa and Johannesburg. You'll have, let's say, a street, and on one side of the street are low-cost housing that people have bought, bond houses, and essentially it's a fairly normal suburb, even if it's a poorer one, where people own their own houses. And then just across the street, you will have a shack settlement or RDP houses or something like that. And quite often, these are part of the same electricity block. And the two sides often get into fights with each other because the people in the informal settlement will often go and steal electricity. They'll tap into the mains and then use that to power the shack settlement. So under this new policy that City Power says is going to be implementing, if you happen to live in an area where most of your neighbors don't pay for electricity, they steal it, they don't pay their bills, if they get a legitimacy, they bypass the meter, whatever, then yeah, no help for you. Sorry. Sara, what do you make of the story?
Look, let's put it this way. If anyone had thought that the electricity could be cut off to a specific property and deal with the bad non-payer, I would have thought they'd have done it ages ago. I mean, there's a definite way to put, over the whole country, a way of, pulling back the load shedding to some extent. But I just wonder, how long is it going to take when they get the call or get the email saying, we have an outage in this area, and we know what the outage, or there's an outage in my house, and this is my area. How long is it going to take them to find out how many people in that zone do not or do pay their electricity?
Right.
I think they've got something like they've got something like 3,400 call-outs logged at the moment. I think it's a way to just say, we can't deal with this. If one guy phones and he hasn't paid, that's it, guys. We'll figure out whether you've all paid, everyone else has paid or not, tomorrow or Friday or another day.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many sort of ugly bits of this. There's the fact that Joburg's billing system to begin with it's better than it was a few years ago, but it's still not fantastic. So maybe they see it as in arrears and actually you're not. And then this really is emblematic of the kind of dysfunctional relationship between government and civilians in South Africa. City Power says that 10 billion rand is outstanding in terms of electricity bills for it. Now, I believe that Soweto, which is kind of traditionally been thought of as like a place that doesn't pay electricity, where it's got low rates of electricity provision, I think they're directly pay to Eskom, actually. So they're not included in the City Power problem here. So that's 10 billion rand outside of Soweto. And in fact, outside of other parts of Johannesburg too, because some of Johannesburg is actually supplied electricity directly by Eskom. And then on top of that, you've also got the city now going ahead with this plan to update the meters of all Johannesburg residents so that they can basically throttle your electricity in an attempt to prevent load shedding. This to me seems like a very poor idea in terms of that, considering the quality of implementation that we've had so far. Marius, what do you make of all this?
Yeah, well, I think there's also going to be some unintended consequences. If you are somebody who's diligently pays electricity every month, but you live now in an area where there's been a fault, and City Power just says, sorry, there's this arbitrary proportion of people in your area who don't pay electricity or pay for electricity, so we're not going to come fix it. What incentive do you have then to continue paying for electricity? It's ridiculous. You also just like, why must I pay? And it's ridiculous. Your money is getting thrown, it's going down the drain then. And it's going to lead to all kinds of perverse outcomes, whatever. And it's also this kind of system of, it's a bit of collective punishment. And I think also just shows that the City Power probably can't go, maybe it doesn't know, or can't figure out who's actually owes electricity and can't go cut off individual homes. Or, I mean, there's also been issues of when people do go when City Power technicians or Eskom, whatever the case is, want to go cut off power, then they get attacked or, threatened with mobs that'll come and, beat people and whatever the case is. So, yeah, I mean, just as an aside, I remember there's a, sorry, go.
I've even heard of cases where technicians go into a repair an area and a mob attacks them for not fixing it fast enough.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, you sort of get where City Power is coming from, but it's also this kind of very dysfunctional relationship between the government and the governed, which I think is also part of the problem. And I don't know if this is kind of a hangover from apartheid, where you didn't really have the consent of all people, consent of all South Africans to be governed. And now, while we a democracy, and in theory, you should have the consent of the government. I don't know if that's maybe also an issue that we have. And there's still this very adversarial relationship between citizens and the governments. And as I say, I don't know if that's a hangover from apartheid or if it's just the kind of, if it's something that's inevitable. But I think that's all what it comes down to. And it's also a very silly solution for a very real problem. And I think it's just probably just city power kind of throwing their hands in there saying this is obviously a terrible outcome or a terrible solution, but this is what we've got to go for, unfortunately.
Not very much so. Any final thoughts, Sara, before we move on?
Yeah, just to say that if I recall correctly, the cities, particularly Johannesburg, were warned years ago that the infrastructure, water and electricity, was becoming decrepit. And we're now living with a failure to take a decision much sooner to start replacing things. And I'm sure most of the outages are a result of things collapsing because they are too old, they need replacing. So we've done it again, another own goal.
And considering the chaos in Joburg's government, I wonder. I haven't read the story yet, but I actually saw there was another article today. The EFF and ANC did get together in the end and put in another Al Jamaah mayor in Joburg, who's immediately been accused of some corruption. But there was a story today that apparently the ANC EFF coalition in Ekurhuleni is in trouble due to disagreements about patronage, I presume. I'll have to read that, which is why we're not talking about it today. But still, it doesn't seem like anything is going to get much better at Joburg in the short term. And I suspect that if the coalition takes over again, they're going to have a very difficult time fixing city power in particular. And I don't think they've had great success so far. But regardless, we'll have to keep an eye on that. Let's go on to our last story for today, and we're just going to cover this one very briefly. But a NGO called the Centre for Information Resilience, based in the UK, was looking at the social media campaigns run supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine, including the hashtags I stand with Russia and I stand with Putin. And they've found that South Africa seems to have played a little bit of a role in some of these campaigns, particularly the daughter of former President Jacob Zuma, Duduzile Zuma, who apparently was what they called a super influencer who boosted these campaigns' virality around the world. She also, I think, was accused by some of being in some way connected to providing the social media impetus to starting the July riots back in 2021. She's got about 237,000 followers on Twitter, which is not insignificant, but not also a huge amount. Marius, what do you make of the story?
I don't think it surprises any of us. That was kind of a targeted, targeted influencing people by Duduzile Zuma. She's probably one of the most toxic people on South African Twitter, I think. And we also know that the Russian government has been getting involved in, large amounts of the domestic policies or politics of lots of countries. And it shouldn't surprise us that they also get involved here in South Africa. I know that I think it was Peter Bruce who said that part of the reason why the South African government is such a big supporter of Russia is because Russia's busy bankrolling the ANC and making sure that the party has money to pay salaries. So this isn't, so I think this is part of it. And I think we should all be quite awake to the fact that there could be some interference in our election next year. And I think it's definitely something to look out for. Maybe not even just from the Russians, from the number of places. And we know Russia's always had quite a big influence within the ANC and the post-1994 government. And I don't think there's anything that's going to change anytime soon. But this doesn't surprise me at all. And as I say, Duduzile Zuma is one of the most toxic people on South African Twitter. So, but the kind of stuff she posts, it does seem a bit unhinged often.
Sorry, your thoughts in 30 seconds or so.
Yeah, I think Duduzile is the daughter who's trying to be the son that Zuma really wanted. She's tough. She adores him, etc., etc. And so she'll follow kind of every line he takes. I also think she's not, lift doesn't go all the way to the top as far as her intellect goes, and it doesn't surprise me. Whether it matters much or not, I agree with you. I'm not sure. I think it does.
Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. We will be back tomorrow with the Daily Friends Show. We hope that you found it interesting, and I hope that you all have a wonderful evening. Cheers, everyone.